Hello everyone, I will share real stories that I know, and I'm sure you will like them. I always thought I had seen everything life had to offer. At 42, I had settled into the rhythm of a predictable existence: work, home, family, nothing surprising, nothing unsettling. That was until I caught my son's friend staring at me like he saw something no one else did. It started subtly, almost unnoticeably, a lingering glance when I walked past, an extra second before looking away. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was nothing more than the casual way young men observe the world. But then the glances turned into something more, a look held too long, eyes following me when he thought I wouldn't notice. I had known Daniel for years. He was always over at the house, a constant presence in my son's life since their school days. I had watched him grow from a quiet boy into a confident young man. He was polite, well-mannered, always greeting me with that easy smile. But lately, something had changed. It wasn't just politeness anymore, it was something else. That evening, I was setting the table while my son and Daniel sat in the living room. They were laughing at some inside joke, the TV playing in the background, their voices low and familiar. I had just bent down to grab something from the lower cabinet when I felt it eyes on me. I straightened slowly, turning just enough to confirm my suspicion. Daniel was watching me, his gaze intense, unwavering. The second our eyes met, he looked away too quickly, like he had been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. A slow warmth curled in my stomach. It wasn't the first time I had felt it, but this was the first time I let myself acknowledge it. The thought should have disturbed me, but it didn't. Instead, I felt a quiet kind of amusement, a curiosity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't naive. I knew when someone was looking at me with something other than casual interest. The question was, why was I suddenly so aware of it? As the evening went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. Every time I moved, every time I spoke, I felt it. The air in the room felt different, charged in a way that made my skin prickle. I decided to test it. When I stood up to clear the dishes, I moved slower than necessary, letting my fingers trail along the table's edge. I didn't have to look to know he was watching. I could feel it. My heartbeat picked up slightly, but I kept my movements smooth, controlled, like I wasn't aware of anything at all. When I returned from the kitchen, I finally glanced in his direction. He wasn't laughing at my son's joke anymore, he wasn't even pretending to. His hands were clasped together, his jaw tight, like he was trying to focus on anything but me. I sat down, pretending not to notice, but a small smile played at the corners of my lips. So, he wanted something to look at. Fine, I'd give him something to see. The next morning, I found myself thinking about the way he had looked at me. It wasn't just that he had stared, it was the way he had tried to hide it, like he knew he shouldn't but couldn't stop himself. That thought lingered with me, teasing me, making me wonder how far this could go. As the days passed, the air between us thickened with something unspoken. I became more and more aware of my movements when he was around, the way I stood, the way I reached for things. I noticed him stiffen when I brushed too close. I noticed how his gaze would drop, then snap away when I caught him. One afternoon, while my son was out, Daniel had stayed behind, saying he wanted to finish watching the game. I was in the kitchen preparing a drink when I heard him approach. "Do you need help with anything?" His voice was casual, but there was an underlying tension in it, one that I recognized immediately. I turned to face him, leaning lightly against the counter, watching as he shifted on his feet. "No, I'm fine," I said, letting my tone hold a touch of amusement. He hesitated before speaking again. You seem different lately." I raised a brow. Different? How? His jaw tightened slightly. "I don't know, just different." A pause stretched between us, the kind that felt longer than it actually was. I held his gaze, watching the flicker of uncertainty there, the hesitation that was laced with something else, something unmistakable. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "And is that a bad thing?" His breath hitched just slightly before he exhaled. "No," he admitted, his voice lower now, "not at all." The silence between us became charged, neither of us willing to break it. I could see the way his hands curled into loose fists at his sides, like he was holding himself back. So, he wasn't just staring anymore, he was waiting. And I wasn't sure how much longer I was willing to make him wait. The tension between us didn't fade, It only grew stronger, the glances, the unspoken moments, the way his breath hitched when our eyes met. It wasn't just my imagination, I knew it now. He wasn't just staring, he was waiting, and so was I. That weekend, my son invited Daniel over again. It had become routine, yet nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. I was in the kitchen when I heard them laughing in the living room, their voices filling the space with an easy familiarity. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, cutting fruit, pouring drinks, but I felt his presence before I even turned. "Hey!" I looked up, meeting his gaze. He leaned against the counter, his fingers drumming lightly against the surface, his casual stance betraying the energy crackling beneath his skin. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice even. My son had stepped out to grab something from his car, leaving us alone. The space between us felt charged, the silence stretching longer than it should have. Daniel cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You seem different lately," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken last time. I tilted my head, a smile playing at the corners of my lips. "And is that a bad thing?" His jaw tightened just a fraction. "No," he admitted, "not at all." He hesitated before taking a step closer. It wasn't an obvious movement, but it changed everything. The air felt heavier, warmer, like something unspoken had settled between us. I could feel the heat of his body from where I stood, and for a moment, I let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in. "You should be careful, Daniel," I murmured, turning back to the counter, forcing myself to refocus. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I know," but he didn't move away. The evening passed in a blur of small moments, his eyes lingering too long, the way he shifted whenever I was near, the way his fingers gripped his drink a little too tightly when I spoke. My son didn't notice, but I did. I noticed everything. Later that night, after my son had gone to bed, Daniel lingered. He stood by the door, hesitating, his fingers flexing at his sides as if debating something. I met his gaze, waiting. "This is dangerous," he finally said, his voice slow, rough. I took a slow breath. "I know." Another long pause, another choice waiting to be made. Then he stepped forward, just enough to close the distance between us. His breath was unsteady, his eyes dark with something unreadable. He wasn't touching me, but he was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. My heart pounded. I could stop this. I could step back, break the moment, pretend none of this had ever happened. But I didn't. I lifted my chin slightly, meeting his gaze head-on. No words were spoken, no confessions made, but we both knew this had gone too far to ignore. His fingers twitched like he wanted to reach for me but was holding himself back. I felt the pull between us, the slow unraveling of restraint, the shift from hesitation to certainty. But then a sound, the creak of a floorboard upstairs, a reminder of reality crashing back in. Daniel exhaled sharply, stepping back, his jaw tight. He ran a hand over his face, letting out a quiet, bitter chuckle. "This isn't over," he said, his voice almost a whisper. I swallowed hard. "No, it's not." He hesitated for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there, my pulse still racing, the warmth of his presence still lingering in the air. I knew things could never be the same, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted them to be.